Hi there! From where I'm sitting, we've had a rather rainy beginning to June, but thankfully May was full of exciting books. I think I did good this month, so I'll tell you all about the winged warriors and the gothic ghosts I met, as well as a rather disappointing thriller. Welcome aboard the International Express to Book Central. Grab a seat, settle in, and let's while away the journey with some book chat. I'm your host, Jules, and yeah, I did some reading this month. I actually also did some foreign language reading, as I had to read a play for my Norwegian course, so that will come in at the end as well. It's quite exciting. Norwegian is a fascinating language. But first, I've got some lovely fantasy sci-fi, and like I said, there are gothic delights coming up as well. Like I said, also some disappointment. That's going to be a rough discussion. I'm still trying to decide how spoilery I want to be. But all of that said, let's just dive straight into the books. The first book I read in May is called The Wings Upon Her Back by Samantha Mills, which actually also came out in May, and I loved this book. So I'm going to give you the blurb from Goodreads for this. 5 gods lie mysteriously sleeping over the city of Redejda. 5 gods who once bestowed great technologies and wisdom, each inspiring the devotion of their own sect. When the gods turned away from humanity, their followers built towers to the heavens to find out why. But when no answer was given, the collective grief of the sects turned to desperation and eventually to war. Xenia was a teenager when she ran away from home to join the mechanically modified warrior sect. She was determined to earn mechanized wings and protect the people and city she loved. Under the strict tutelage of a mercurial, charismatic leader, Xenia became Winged Zemolai. But after 26 years of service, Zemolai is disillusioned with her role as an enforcer in an increasingly fascist state. After one tragic act of mercy, she is cast out and loses everything she worked for. As Zemolai fights for her life, she begins to understand the true nature of her sect, her leader, and the gods themselves. I mean, what a blurb. Am I right? Like, that just drew me straight in. So, of course, I wanted to read this book, also because I've always wanted to fly. It's one of those things, if I could choose a superpower, it would probably be flight. But anyway, I wanted to take my time with this book, because from the blurb, I already had the feeling that, there would be world building, that maybe some of it would be quite complex. We're covering a lot of time, potentially. But actually, I just flowed right into this book. Don't know how Samantha Mills did it, but I was there almost from the beginning. In short, you have to imagine this city, Redejda, and it has these 5 potential portals above it that towers have been built to, and that's where the gods sleep. But we really focus in on our main character and on her journey, on how she's developed, and the world kind of gets built around that as it becomes relevant, which I really enjoyed. So you don't get this massive info dump, you just get to explore and discover how this world works as you move with the main character. And this works quite well also because we get a kind of double perspective from the main character. So we see how Xenia, as a young girl, wants to become a winged warrior, how she wants to join this mechanical sect, whereas her family are in the scholar sect. And she starts training, then she manages to join, and we see how she, under the tutelage of her mentor, becomes a winged warrior and how she becomes Zemolai. So on the one hand, we have this young girl growing up and discovering maybe how the world works. And I think she's only 14 when she starts training with them. And her leader, so she's called the Winged Vodaya, she is her idol. Xenia admires this woman so much and she wants to be exactly like her when she grows up. So on the one hand, we have this quite hopeful but also quite naive voice at the beginning. But the novel actually starts with Zemolai as an older woman. And she has been a winged warrior for 28 years now. She's worked so hard. Her implants, with how the wings are connected, like her body is starting to fall apart. And Semolai is a little disillusioned now that she is in her late 30s. And it starts with this act of mercy where technically Semolai breaks the rules. But because she's already disillusioned, it is mercy, but it's also almost like an act of rebellion. At least that's how I read it. But she gets kicked out, as the blurb says. That's not really a spoiler. It happens in the first chapter. And then the novel moves back and forth between this young Xenia being trained and becoming Semolai, and the older Semolai being kicked out, having to start all over again, having these doubts about her world. And it's just interwoven so beautifully that you get to know this young girl, but you know the woman she's become, and you are trying to unify those two people in your mind. And it's just done so well. It's just started raining outside. I don't know if the mic will pick that up, but if it does, I am sorry. Like I said, the weather here is atrocious. So it's a beautiful novel. Xenia/Semolai is absolutely the heart of it. There are also other characters around it, like, for example, Voraya, her mentor. And that is a really crucial relationship, but it's also a very difficult one. So it's one of those mentor-student relationships that feels toxic, and yet you can absolutely see how Xenia falls into that as a teenager, and how there's no defense, and the long-lasting consequences it can have on your life when someone kind of takes that naivety and youth and pours it into their own purpose, right? So that is a very interesting aspect of the novel. It might be hard to read for some people, but I think Samantha Mills handles it very well. It's never exploitative, but it is precise. So yeah, I found it very affecting. Semolai also ends up kind of encountering maybe some rebels once she gets kicked out. I think that is done really well. Those characters are really interesting, and because they're also still so much younger, they remind you of the young Xenia. And yet, from the older Semolai's perspective, you're like, what are you planning on doing? You're 15, 18, 20, like, you're going to topple the regime? Sure. So all of that is going on. I think these characters are built up very interestingly, and I just love the world and the idea of these gods and what are gods. And the novel definitely expands upon those themes as well of trying to figure out what you're believing in, what stories are being told, how stories change, and how that can affect what you're doing, and how your life can be led astray, and it can hurt because it's what you've always believed in. And it's a beautiful book. Please just read it. It still makes me want to fly, even though it doesn't sound like the most delightful of things. But I adored this book. It is one of my favorite books of the year so far, and it's a pretty strong contender for ending up in my top 10 by December. I will definitely be rereading it, and anything Samantha Mills writes in the future, I'm there. After that, after diving into such a beautifully constructed and fascinating world, I thought, I need a break. I need something fun, something that won't try and compete with The Wings Upon Her Back for any title of favorite sci-fi so far. And so I dove into a thriller, and that was Daughter of Mine by Megan Miranda. And here is your blurb. When Hazel Sharp, daughter of Mirror Lake's longtime local detective, unexpectedly inherits her childhood home, she's warily drawn back to the town and people she left behind almost a decade earlier. But Hazel's not the only relic of the past to return. A drought has descended on the region, and as the water level in the lake drops, long-hidden secrets begin to emerge, including evidence that may help finally explain the mystery of her mother's disappearance. So I'd heard about Megan Miranda before, and I'd seen a lot of people be very positive about her books, so I thought, yes, let's dive in. And the first thing I have to say is that plot device of the drought works so well, because first of all, it's a very natural, literally, way for evidence to emerge, but it also builds a certain pressure, right? So we're probably going to get thunderstorms here later, and you know how you can feel it in the air when pressure is building up and like something has to give. And because that's already happening in Hazel's environment, it makes so much sense that all the other kind of tensions are also coming to a boiling point. So we start the novel at the funeral of Hazel's father, and the attention there is kind of split because people respected him a lot. He was like, the police chief of the town, so everyone knows him, everyone knows everyone anyway. So they want to show respect, but also the drought means the lake level has dropped, so now they're finding a car. And everyone's like, how did this car end up there? So people are like on their phones, etc. And you immediately get this kind of tension that Hazel's like, I actually do not want to be in this town. I left for a reason, but now I'm here. And then things kind of escalate from there, especially once she finds out that she has inherited the home. And her two brothers are like, wait, hold up. And they both work in the police force as well. And then for the first third of the novel, I would say, a lot of things get brought up and you can very easily be suspicious of all of it. There's family disputes, the normal rivalry between siblings, and yet also rivalry that does not feel normal. We begin to learn more about how and why her mother maybe disappeared. There are old friendships that she's considering kind of bringing back to life or not. And Hazel is a very active protagonist. She's someone who wants to get things done. And I like that about her because while the mystery kind of takes place around her, it's triggered by the drought, not by her reappearance or anything, but she is very much acting and doing things. She's proactive in the narrative rather than just reacting to what's happening, like I said. Some of the characters around her aren't given quite as much depth, but there were definitely a few moments with each character I was like, what are we setting up here? What are we doing here? I can see you, Megan Miranda. You're plotting. And that was quite fun. I hadn't necessarily seen the ending coming. I'd suspected other characters. One character I continued to be suspicious about, even though apparently they were fine, but I was like, nah, I don't like what's happening here. But that might just be a personal taste. As with a lot of thrillers, the ending did feel a little too abrupt for me, where suddenly things kind of got resolved. And I appreciate that we were at the end of the story. Like, this was the moment where things had to be resolved. But there is a way of doing that, I think, where it doesn't feel quite as sudden. However, I liked it. I had a good time with it. I liked the tension Megan Miranda built. I did like her characters as well. And overall, I would absolutely read anything else by her. I had a great time with her book. And unfortunately, I cannot say the same for the next thriller. After I read Daughter of Mine, I figured, you know what, we're on a roll. We're enjoying these thrillers. Let's dive into another one. And the one I chose was The Alone Time by Elle Marr. Now, I have to say, I read Elle Marr's The Family Bones, I think, a while back. And I love that. I thought she did a great job there. That novel is kind of about a young woman who joins her family for a weekend away. And she hopes to learn about kind of their legacy of psychopathy. So there's something in that family. And this young girl is like, okay, I want to figure out what's going on with my family. I want to figure out what is in the family bones and whether I'm okay. And I thought she handled mental illness and just general those topics quite well in that book. I liked how tightly plotted it was, the different characters, etc. So when I saw that she had this new book come out, The Alone Time, I was like, yeah, I'm down. Yeah. I'm going to read you the blurb first. Fiona and Violet Seng were just children when their family's Cessna crash-landed in the Washington wilderness, claiming the lives of their parents. For 12 harrowing weeks, the girls fended for themselves before being rescued. 25 years later, they're still trying to move on from the trauma. Fiona repurposes it into controversial works of art. Violet has battled addiction and failed relationships to finally progress towards normalcy as a writer. The strange sisters never speak about what they call their alone time in the wild. They wouldn't dare until they become the subject of a documentary that renews public fascination with the girl survivors and questions their version of the events. When disturbing details about the Seng family are exposed, a strange woman claims to know the crash was deliberate. Fiona and Violet must come together to face the horrifying truth of what happened out there and what they learned about their parents and themselves, before any other secrets emerge from the woods. So I was down for this. I used to be quite a big true crime fan until I started questioning kind of the ethics of all of that, where I was like, I think it's good to explore what has happened, to kind of honor victims. On the other hand, I don't want it to become my entertainment. I don't want it to be pure content. So I've been questioning that for a while, and I like the idea here that this documentary kind of digs into their past and that this might be cruel to them, and that it brings up all these different ideas, but also traumas that they should be allowed to just move on from. So I had all kinds of expectations based on my previous Elmar reading experience and on the blurb, and unfortunately, what emerged was a novel that felt really messy. Yeah, it did not work. So Fiona and Violet are our main characters, and the narrative kind of splits back and forth between them. We get both of their points of view. Unfortunately for me, those voices were not distinctive enough, which means that quite often I had to kind of flip back and be like, wait, who is this again? And who was she? So like Fiona is the older sister and Violet is the younger one. And I was like, okay, Fiona's older. She does art. Her chapters will probably mention art. Whereas Violet is the one who had addiction issues, and that will probably get mentioned in every chapter. So that's how I then kind of managed to divide them in my head, but it took quite a long time. And then between that, we also, at the beginning of the novel, get perspectives from their parents. So first from her father and then from her mother, and they kind of inform what happened. So we also flick back and forth in time, but those past perspectives come, if I remember correctly, purely from their parents, whereas Fiona's and Violet's perspectives are mostly from the present. So the anniversary of their alone time in the woods has come up, and this documentary comes up, and this woman emerges who says she knows things all these decades later. And now the sisters have to reconnect, and they don't really want to. They live completely separate lives, really. And I was really hoping for something else. I don't know how to. It's hard to describe what isn't there. But and that's what I'm kind of trying to do, but I didn't feel a real connection between the sisters. They, even though their perspectives are not really differentiated in the sense of voice, well, because of that, they feel so similar. And I'm like, well, why would you not be talking? I don't understand what's happening. And this is a typical example of, oh, I'm not being told things. Especially by the end, I realized that one of the reasons a lot of things do not make sense or I didn't understand what was going on was because things were being kept from me in order to have a twist. And the twist was garbage. I did not like it. So I'm going to briefly move into some spoilers here. I think I'm going to keep it relatively gentle with the spoilers, but like a lot of thrillers from what I thought was the past, I thought we were beyond this. The Alone Time uses mental health as a reason for crime, as a reason for things going wrong. And I didn't like that. But it then also brings in certain potentially supernatural aspects, which I didn't like, because it just muddies the water, right? I was like, okay, are you blaming mental illness or are you saying something else is going on? Are you blaming this person? Are you blaming that person? The last 20 odd pages of this novel are random. So much suddenly gets revealed that does not make sense to me. There was also a side character who is a potential romantic interest. Well, all the romantic interests are hot garbage, but him especially, he builds up a sort of relationship with Violet. There is no reason for him to be there except for a weird, like, shocking thing at the end, which didn't make sense. And all of it just made me go, what did I read? So I wasn't pleased with how the novel was set up or how it progressed. I gave it quite a lot of grace at the beginning, and then about halfway mark, I was like, I'm finishing this because I technically want to know what you're going to do with it. And yeah. And then by the end, I was just a bit offended almost at what happened with mental illness and how shoddily everything was tied together at the end. So yeah, and it was extra disappointing because I liked Elmar's previous novel, and now I don't know if I would want to read something else by her. So I find that difficult. I feel like this could have benefited from a really tight editing round of maybe a sensitivity reader or two, because all of it could have worked potentially if it had been tightened up, if it had been set up in a way that makes sense. And yet, that's not what's happening here. So this was my first 2-star review in a very long time. I tend to not give many low ratings, mainly because I stop reading if I don't like it. And in this case, I kept going because I did want to know how it ended. So I was like, okay, I won't give it a 1-star because I was technically invested, but I did not appreciate this. So I wouldn't recommend The Alone Time by Elmar. I would recommend her book, The Family Bones. Maybe I should reread that to see if it was actually as good as I thought it was. So yeah, I was conflicted about that. After a slightly shoddy thriller, let's put it that way, I thought I should dive back into the Gothic. I was like, okay, we're clearly looking for a certain ambiance, a certain vibe, and none of this is it. So let's just go straight to the Gothic genre. And thankfully, I had a review copy of a book waiting for me, and this book is called My Darling Dreadful Thing by Johanna van Veen. And she's a Dutch author, but as far as I'm aware, she wrote this book in English. It's not a translation, it was directly written in English, but it's very much set in the Netherlands, and I adored diving into my own past this way. But here's the blurb. In a world where the dead can wake and walk amongst us, what is truly real? Roos Beckman has a spirit companion only she can see. Ruth, strange, corpse-like, and dead for centuries, is the only good thing in Roos's life, which is filled with sordid backroom seances organized by her mother. That is, until wealthy young widow Agnes Knoop attends one of the seances and asks Roos to come live with her at the crumbling estate she inherited upon the death of her husband. The manner is unsettling, but the attraction between Roos and Agnes is palpable. So how does someone end up dead? I'm going to leave it there. The blurb actually continues on for a bit, but what I enjoyed about this novel, which I try to do with almost every book, is that I look at the blurb, buy it, or request it on NetGalley, and then leave it for a bit until I've forgotten everything about the blurb. So I can go in knowing that I chose it, but no longer remembering why. So I'm going to leave you a little bit up in the air there. However, I adored My Darling Dreadful Thing. And our main person is Roos, and she helps her mother make money through seances. So she has this spirit companion, Ruth. And Ruth is absolutely real, to Roos at least. But the seances in themselves are fake. Roos just has a kind of list of information about their guests her mother gives her, and then she does her best with the help of Ruth to come up with something to help these people, right? But Roos has been generally neglected and abused by her mother. And Johanna van Veen does have a short kind of foreword at the beginning of the book where she talks about some of the content warnings, I guess, but also the reason that they're there. And I think that was actually really good because it didn't spoil anything for me, but it did help set the scene. Because the Gothic genre is a perfect medium, I would say, for describing trauma, for talking about difficult themes and subjects just because of its atmosphere. And Johanna van Veen makes very clear that these difficult themes are in there, but that they're not meant to be sensational, if that makes sense. So yeah, Roos has a very difficult childhood, and this does get described, and it is difficult to read, but it informs her character very much. But everything changes for Roos once Agnes Knoop comes to visit, and the two are connected. Agnes invites Roos to her mansion called Rozentuin, so Rose Garden. And from there, it just becomes this very interesting mix between their relationship developing and Roos realizing certain things are wrong. And the reason it works really well is that the novel in many ways is told in retrospect. So like the blurb says, someone does die. And the narration by Roos is interrupted by doctor notes. So after whatever happens has happened, she meets with a doctor who asks her, okay, what happened? Who is this ghost that you imagine, etc. And they're a very clinical discussion on the one hand, but they also let us see Roos through different eyes. My cat has just jumped on the table. They let us see her through different eyes. And it was a really good device, in my opinion. It worked really well to interrupt the tension at the right moment through the narration, and to give some extra background, and to also allow the reader to make up their own mind about whether Rose is making up Ruth, whether she's imagined all of this, if it's one big trauma response or if it's real. So it plays with that ambivalence of the Gothic genre really well. I also just enjoyed the way it was written. It is definitely, a British Gothic novel with a dilapidated mansion, etc. But it is set in the Netherlands, and it is very much infused with Dutch history and Dutch customs. Especially the colonial past of the Netherlands is addressed through the figure of Agnes, who is half Indonesian. And I really like that because, again, the Gothic genre is there to delve up things from the past. And Johanna van Veen does that really well with Dutch colonial history. I would absolutely read whatever she publishes next. I could, at times, also because the Gothic genre is quite flowery, I could sense that as well in the novel, and I look forward to seeing kind of how Johanna van Veen's writing develops. And I'm definitely going to see if she wrote anything in Dutch. I had to take a small recording break there, on the one hand to satisfy my cat's demands for mayhem, but also because the church bells were going wild outside. And while church bells might have fit the previous book, it does not fit the next one I read, because that was Neon Gods by Katie Robert. As you might remember if you've listened to my previous reading wrap-up episodes, I have a friend with whom I buddy read romance books, because they're way more fun if you can exchange messages and giggle about what's going on. And we decided to dive into Neon Gods because we both love the Persephone and Hades myths. So here we go with our blurb. Society darling Persephone Dimitriou plans to flee the ultra-modern city of Olympus and start over far from the backstabbing politics of the 13 houses. But all that's ripped away when her mother ambushes her with an engagement to Zeus, the dangerous power behind their glittering city's dark facade. With no options left, Persephone flees to the forbidden Undercity and makes a devil's bargain with a man she once believed a myth, a man who awakens her to a world she never knew existed. Hades has spent his life in the shadows and has no intention of stepping into the light. But when he finds that Persephone can offer a little slice of the revenge he spent years craving, it's all the excuse he needs to help her, for a price. Yet every breathless night spent tangled together has given Hades a taste for Persephone, and he'll go to war with Olympus itself to keep her close. So yeah, it's the Hades and Persephone myth retold in a more kind of urban fantasy setting almost, and it is spicy. The sex is explicit and it occurs throughout the book, so that is your general warning for that. However, what I ended up actually very much enjoying was the world building. My friend and I were exchanging voice notes on WhatsApp saying like, "Ooh, I wonder what this means. I wonder what that means. I like this. I like that." So what I really enjoyed about Neon Gods was how Katie Robert adapted the kind of mythology of the Greek gods to a more modern setting. So you have these 13 houses which represent 13 gods, and the gods are almost like a role that you take on, and certain roles like Zeus or Hades are inherited roles. They stay within a family, and others, like for example the role of Demeter, so Persephone's mother, that is an elected role. And I really liked how these different gods then have different kind of election rights. I think Ares wins his role by defeating someone else in combat, etc. So all of that kind of works. And Olympus is now a city, and it has this kind of upper city that's all shiny and glittery, and then the undercity where Hades rules, except everyone thinks Hades is a myth. So that worked quite well. I was intrigued by what was going on. I liked the idea of revenge and this sort of my enemy's enemy is my friend. So Persephone and Hades are going to join together to get their wishes, whether that is revenge or just getting away. But then, of course, feelings get in the way and all of that. I liked it. It was short but sweet. It's not a big book. We kind of raced through it because it's very easy to read. What I did like is that although the book is explicit in its sexual content and some of it could be interpreted not as dark romance per se, but perhaps as more risky sexual content, Katie Robert spent a lot of time building in conversations about consent without being like, we now have to discuss consent. But rather it was like, okay, This is what we're going to do. Are you cool with this? If we do this, are you fine? Is our bargain still in play? Are we good? Are you good? And then, of course, emotions come in and it's like, but the two communicate quite nicely. I like the world that Katie Robert built. The time span across which the book takes place is quite short. So while it wasn't like an insta-love kind of thing, it was an instant attraction that the two then, as consenting adults, acted upon rather quickly. So there wasn't like a burning yearning as much. I like it when two characters sort of have to take some time to develop their feelings and figure things out. And here, while they took some time figuring their feelings out, the sexual aspect didn't take a lot of time to get introduced. But again, I did enjoy it. It was written nicely. I think we're going to read the next one because we need distraction from real life with funny romance books. So I'll be reading the next one as well. We'll see how far we get in the series. I hope for a bit more yearning in the next one, I'll be honest. But it was a good time. It was a fun time. I had no real complaints. However, after that rather quick romance experience, I did want to go back to the Gothic, and I finally settled down with a book I'd been meaning to read for ages, and that is The Cherry Robbers by Sarai Walker. Here is your blurb. New Mexico, 2017. Sylvia Wren is one of the most important American artists of the past century. Known as a recluse, she avoids all public appearances. There's a reason. She's living under an assumed identity, having outrun a tragic past. But when a hungry journalist starts chasing her story, she's confronted with whom she once was, Iris Chappell. Connecticut, 1950. Iris Chappell is the second youngest of 6 sisters, all heiresses to a firearms fortune. They've grown up cloistered in a palatial Victorian house, mostly neglected by their distant father and troubled mother, who believes that their house is haunted by the victims of Chappell weapons. The girls long to escape, and for most of them, the only way out is marriage. But not long after the first Chappell sister walks down the aisle, she dies of mysterious causes, a tragedy that repeats with the second, leaving the rest to navigate the wreckage to heart-wrenching consequences. So, we're back in the realm of the Gothic, of abandoned or slightly dilapidated houses, dramatic family curses, potential ghosts, etc. And this book just made me really grateful about the time I was born in. I mean, nothing is perfect now. Far from it. Women's rights are under attack every day. But I do just remember, while reading this, thinking back to stories from my grandmothers, but also even my mother, and just that difficult balance of trying to find your own desire in life, fulfilling your own dreams, and yet also having this expectation of marriage, etc., and all the limitations that come with it. There's a certain claustrophobia to that, and I think The Cherry Robbers picks up on that in a really interesting way. It is a novel about how generation after generation of women kind of pass on their own hopes and dreams to their daughters, but also their own pains and traumas. And like I said, again, this is a Gothic book, and the Gothic genre excels at being a space for trauma to be discussed. And so it's not an easy read. There are also depictions of mental health and asylums, death, self-harm, but again, it is done in a very generous way, I would say. You don't get the sense that she's exploiting pain to tell a Gothic dramatic tale, but rather that Sarai Walker employs the drama and atmosphere of the Gothic to tell a story about pain. So our main character is Iris, but also Sylvia, and she is the same person. Sylvia is the identity she assumed, and this journalist kind of digging into her past encourages Sylvia to finally face her past to a certain extent as well. And she decides to write down her memories. And so after a little introduction to Sylvia and to what is going on, we then dive into her memoirs, into her notes. And she describes the life she had with her sisters, how the first one married and died, etc. And it just builds so much atmosphere. And just like in Daughter of Mine, where I said that the heat really added to the suspense and pressure of the book, the same is kind of true of 1950s Connecticut, I feel. The kind of luscious but also warm environment that Sarai Walker creates there. You can just feel the pressure building up within that house. The house feels so airless. if that makes sense. Like there's no escape out of this house except marriage, and it just, yeah, it makes a beautifully claustrophobic atmosphere. The way the novel skips kind of from past to present, I would say it maintains a very nice kind of arc of tension throughout. Sylvia/Iris is something of an unreliable narrator perhaps, but because she's narrating her own past, she also has insights she didn't at the time, and I don't know, it just worked really well for me. I really enjoy just sinking away into this book, into the world that it creates, the questions it asks but leaves open as well. Yeah, it was just an excellent book, I would say. It was another 5 stars for me for this one. I loved how dramatic the novel was without taking advantage of what it was talking about. And the idea of this curse on the sisters or ghosts in an otherwise normal world, how no one seems to believe Iris or the other sisters, and so how that becomes a symbol for how sometimes women's stories and experiences are dismissed. It felt like a very strong point that was being made. If you want your writing a little more subtle, then, or your messaging a little more subtle, then maybe this isn't quite it. But I thought the way it was built up was very good. And so I can only recommend The Cherry Robbers by Sarai Walker. And with that, we're at my last read of the month, which was Et Dukkehjem by Henrik Ibsen, also known in English as A Doll's House. This is a play that Henrik Ibsen wrote in 1879, and it's about a woman called Nora, and when we meet her in the first act, she seems a bit flighty, a little ditzy. Her husband calls her his little songbird and stuff like that, and she doesn't seem to have a lot of important things going on in her life. She just seems a bit childish. And a friend of hers actually says this to her, that she's such a child. But then Nora reveals that actually she has a massive secret, which is that when her husband Torvald was ill, she took out a loan in order to make sure they could travel to Italy where he could recover. And she pretended as if this money was an inheritance from her father, but actually what she did was take out a loan, which was illegal for women at the time. So she has this massive secret. She's still trying to pay off this loan, but unfortunately the man who gave her the loan at the bank, who underwrote it, so to say, he has just been fired by her husband, and now he's rocked up and he's like, you better make sure your husband does not actually fire me, or I will reveal what you've done. And the rest of the play kind of works with how she's maybe trying to hide what she has done, but then it also becomes clear that this has to come out. And, well, I can't really spoil a play that's this old, but warning here, skip ahead to the outro if you don't want to hear. But eventually it does come out, and her husband is informed of what has happened, and he is so mad. On the one hand, because she's committed a crime technically, because by taking out this loan, she pretended her father co-signed it, but he'd already died at that point. So she committed fraud, basically, and that is something he's upset about, but he's even more mad that he now looks weak, as if his wife had to support him, or as if he can't control his wife. And so he's in an uproar, in a state, but then this man who undersigned the loan actually sends them the bond for it, and he's like, you know what, I've changed my mind, I'm not going to hold this over your head, I'm sorry. And then suddenly the husband is like, oh, so everything's fine, I'm saved, I'm good. And Nora, who's been a bit ditzy throughout much of the play, she's kind of come to this awareness as her husband freaked out that she's been a doll to him and to her father. And that's, of course, where the title comes from. But that she's never had a chance to form her own opinions, that she's always been guided, that she's always been, separated from real life in a way, and that she cannot live like this anymore, that her husband doesn't actually love her as an individual, but as a plaything that he can take care of. And the novel ends with her leaving, him and their children, kind of slamming the door behind her. I first read this play during my bachelor's for an Introduction to Drama module, and I loved it back then, especially in that final act when Nora has this actual serious conversation with her husband and stands up for herself and says, I have to put my responsibility to myself as a human being before my responsibilities towards you as my husband or towards my children. I was amazed that this was written in the 19th century. And reading it now again in Norwegian was fascinating as well, and I once again was totally in the play. It remains a fascinating text, and I think the tension throughout builds up really well, where you end up not really having that much respect for Nora, and then by the end, she really has grown. My cat is once again walking across my desk. The Norwegian that it's written in, because it is from the late 19th century, is very Danish. So if you're used to nynorsk or bokmål norsk, for example, you might struggle with this a little bit. I'm thankfully at the point where my Norwegian is good enough that I can understand it, but it's not so good that I get annoyed at different spellings. So I got into it quite easily. But it did also remind me that I had an issue with the play back in the day, and that I still have that issue, which is that Ibsen was inspired to write this because of the experiences of another female author who lived in Norway at the time. That was Sara Kieler. She'd written a book and she'd sent it to Ibsen, who was already a notable playwright at that time, and he didn't like it, but they did stay in contact. And then her husband got ill, and she took out a loan, and she asked Ibsen's help to advertise her book so that she could sell more books and pay off that loan. And he refused because he didn't like the book, so he refused to help her. And then her husband found out, and he divorced her and denied her access to her children, which is what Nora's husband threatens to do in the play as well. And this woman, Sarah, actually had a nervous breakdown and ended up in an asylum until a few years later her husband forgave her and allowed her to come back into his life and the lives of their children. And this was a woman's real lived experience, and there was stigma and there was shame, and Ibsen had stood at the sidelines of this, had not helped, and then used it to write his probably most famous play. And of course, when it came out, it affected this woman all over again, because most people in the scene knew that it was about her. And she became known as Ibsen's Nora rather than as an author or a playwright in her own right. And she apparently did ask him, at a certain point they met again, and she was like, can I at the very least say publicly that it's not about me, or could you say that? And Ibsen refused, and that you had a confrontation, and he used that confrontation to inspire a further play. And I'm like, sir, you can't just use women's lived experiences as inspiration this way, like you're exploiting it. So that's a massive issue I have with it, and I think it makes A Doll's House a very conflicting feminist text, because on the one hand, there is such power in Nora leaving, in her prioritizing herself, even if it made her slightly monstrous in the eyes of some 19th century audiences. Especially the German audience did not like it, and Ibsen had to write an ending in which Nora stays to assuage German kind of politeness. But it's such a powerful text in that sense. And on the other hand, it is based on the exploitation of another woman, which makes it so questionable. And I think it is absolutely a text one should read, I think, if one's interested in feminist literature and feminist drama. But you should read it with that knowledge as well, knowing that it is itself based on an exploitation. While Nora says that she's never been seen as an individual, has never had the place to grow and to be her own person, Ibsen did the same to someone else and kind of took their personhood for his own work and made Sarah into a little puppet and a little doll in his own construction. So yeah, conflicting thoughts, conflicting feelings, but it is a very good play. All right, so that was my reading for May. I'm now going to try and edit this down so it's not actually 45 minutes. We'll see how that goes. I'd love to hear what you thought, what you've read, and that's it for today. If you have questions, thoughts on the book, or recommendations or requests for future episodes, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email at bookcentralpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to be informed when new episodes drop. You can find references to the materials used today in the description. Book Central is written and produced by me, and our music is by Scott Buckley. Thank you for joining me today on the International Express to Book Central.